I still remember that night vividly, the kind of night that sticks with you, crawling under your skin, making you feel like you're never truly safe. It all started when we moved into that house next to Mrs. Caldwell, an elderly woman who lived alone. She seemed nice enough at first. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I should have trusted my instincts. When we first bought the house, my husband Steve and I were excited. It was in a quiet neighborhood, and we loved the idea of starting a family here. The house was older, but it had charm. It was perfect for us. The neighbors seemed friendly, especially Mrs. Caldwell. She had this grandmotherly vibe, always waving from her porch, inviting us over for tea, and offering to help with anything we needed. At first, I thought it was just Southern hospitality, but it didn't take long before I realized something wasn't right. It started with little things, odd noises at night, doors creaking open on their own, and the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to being new to the house, maybe old pipe settling, or even the wind playing tricks on me. But as time went on, things got stranger. One evening, around dusk, I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard a tapping on the window. It wasn't just a random tap. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. I looked up, my heart racing, and saw Mrs. Caldwell standing outside, staring directly at me. I quickly got up to open the window, thinking she needed something, but when I pulled it open, she just smiled and said, "Good evening, dear. Just wanted to make sure you were home." I smiled back, though I was unnerved. "Thanks, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm just reading." "Good, good. Keep your doors locked tonight," she said cryptically, then turned and walked back toward her house without another word. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that followed me for the rest of the evening. That night, when Steve got home from work, I told him about the strange encounter. He brushed it off, saying she was just an old woman who might have been worried about us. But I knew something wasn't right. Mrs. Caldwell had never been that forward before. The next night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud banging sound coming from the kitchen. I jolted upright, my heart racing. It was as if someone was pounding on the walls. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed out of the bedroom, trying not to wake Steve. When I reached the kitchen, I found the back door wide open, the wind blowing through the curtains, making the banging noise. But that wasn't what chilled me to the bone. What I saw was worse. There, standing in the doorway, was Mrs. Caldwell. I froze. Her thin, frail figure was barely illuminated by the moonlight, and she was staring at me with a look of pure hatred. She didn't say a word, just stood there. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing up. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that silent, unnerving stare. Finally, I mustered enough courage to speak. "Mrs. Caldwell, what are you doing here?" Her smile was cold and unnatural. "Just checking on you, dear. You're all alone, aren't you? You should be careful. Things aren't always what they seem, you know." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Why had she been there in the middle of the night? And what did she mean by "things aren't always what they seem"? The next few days were filled with tension. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed louder. Every gust of wind made the house feel more like a trap. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I knew deep down something was off. Steve, though, remained skeptical. He still thought it was nothing more than my overactive imagination. But then things escalated. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone when I heard someone at the door. I opened it, expecting to see a package or maybe a neighbor, but instead I was greeted by the cold, empty porch. No one was there. I stepped outside, confused, when I noticed something strange. A pile of dirt had been carefully stacked in front of our door as if someone had been digging. My heart pounded in my chest. I bent down to inspect the dirt, my hand shaking as I brushed it aside. There, half buried beneath it, was a small rusted key. I didn't know what it was for, but I knew I had to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, but even after it was gone, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. I didn't tell Steve about the key. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I had a sinking feeling it was something I wasn't supposed to know. A week later, something happened that I still can't explain. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I heard a voice whispering my name. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there, coming from the living room. "Is someone there?" I called out, but there was no response. I hesitated, then slowly walked into the living room. That's when I saw it. Mrs. Caldwell was sitting on our couch, looking at me with that same cold, emotionless smile. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just kept smiling. "I told you, dear, I'm always watching over you." Before I could react, she stood up, walked to the front door, and stepped outside. I rushed to the window, my heart racing, but by the time I looked out, she was gone, vanished. I was terrified, but still, I didn't want to tell Steve. I knew he'd just think I was losing my mind, but I couldn't take it anymore. Something was wrong with that woman, and it wasn't just her odd behavior. It was something darker, something sinister. That night, I lay awake, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. And that's when I heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears. The door to our bedroom creaked open. Then a whisper. "Don't worry, dear, I'm just checking on you." I snapped my eyes open. The room was empty. The footsteps had stopped, but it was too late. I knew then that I had to leave. The next morning, I packed our things and left without saying goodbye. Steve didn't understand, but I couldn't stay there another minute. I never spoke to Mrs. Caldwell again. I'm not sure if she was a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something worse, but I do know one thing. That house was never safe. I don't know what happened to Mrs. Caldwell after we moved out. I don't know if she's still there, still watching, still lurking in the shadows. But I do know this. If you ever move into a house next to an elderly neighbor who seems a little too interested in your life, be careful, because not everything in the world is what it seems.
Next story.
It started innocently enough. We moved into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, looking for a fresh start. The house was small but cozy, with a white picket fence and a perfectly manicured lawn. The kind of place where you expect to get home from work and wave to the neighbor as they water their garden. For the first few weeks, everything was just like that. Neighbors waved, small talk at the mailbox, nothing strange. But then I started noticing things that didn't make sense, things that made my skin crawl. It started with the lights. Every night, I'd see the house across the street flicker on and off. At first, I thought it was just an old house with bad wiring, but it seemed different. The lights would flicker in a pattern, almost as if someone were testing them, turning them off and on, until the street was in complete darkness. Sometimes it would stop for a while, only to start again the next night. I mentioned it to my husband, but he just shrugged it off, claiming it was probably a power surge or some weird quirk of the electrical grid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I remember the first time I saw her. It was late one evening, just after the flickering stopped. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book by the soft glow of our own lamp, when I happened to glance out the window. Across the street, there she was, standing in front of the house, just staring at me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I realized she was there. A woman in her late 50s, maybe 60s, with long gray hair, wearing a long, tattered white dress. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, I don't think I'll ever forget her eyes. They were wide open, staring at me, unblinking, like she was waiting for something. I quickly pulled the curtains shut, but the image of her lingered in my mind. The next day, I saw her again. This time, she wasn't just standing there. She was pacing back and forth on the porch, whispering to herself, moving in slow, deliberate motions. I didn't know what to think. She had always been so quiet, my neighbor. I'd never spoken to her directly, but she always waved when I saw her in her yard. She'd even been friendly once, bringing over a small plate of cookies when we first moved in. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe she was just having a bad day. Maybe she was lonely. But the more I saw of her, the more unsettling it became. Her behavior was becoming erratic. She started walking up and down her driveway at all hours, muttering under her breath and occasionally laughing to herself in a way that made my blood run cold. That's when things really started to get weird. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking at my door. It was 3 a.m. I was groggy, half awake, and confused. The knocking came again, harder this time. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see a stranger, but instead it was her, my neighbor. I opened the door slightly, asking, "Are you okay?" Her face was ashen, her eyes wide and unfocused. "She's coming for you," she whispered. "She's coming for you all." I didn't know what to say. I tried to close the door, but her hand shot out, grabbing the frame with surprising strength. "She won't stop until you're gone," she said, her voice hoarse and desperate. I pulled the door closed and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was just imagining things or if something truly horrifying was happening in my quiet little neighborhood. The next morning, I saw her again. This time, she wasn't pacing the driveway. She was standing in her front yard, staring directly at me. Her eyes were empty now, like hollow voids, and there was something about her posture that made me feel sick. It was as if she were waiting for something, and I knew that whatever it wasn't good. I called the police, telling them about the strange behavior and the late night knocking. They sent an officer over to check on her, but by the time he arrived, she was nowhere to be found. The officer knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He even checked the yard, but there were no signs of anyone. "Probably just a misunderstanding," he said, giving me a sympathetic smile. "Old folks sometimes get confused, especially if they're living alone." But I didn't feel like it was a misunderstanding. I couldn't explain it. But something deep inside me told me that she wasn't just confused, she was in danger. Something was driving her to madness. That night, I decided to take a walk. I had to clear my head. I needed to get away from the house, from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over everything. As I walked down the street, I saw her house again, and that's when I noticed something truly horrifying. The lights were flickering again. But this time it was different. The lights weren't just flickering in the usual pattern. They were flashing erratically, almost as if something was trying to reach out. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my heart racing. And then, just as I was about to turn away, something moved in the window. It was her, but she wasn't alone. There was something else standing behind her, something tall and shadowy with glowing eyes. I froze. I couldn't breathe. My feet felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. The shadow figure moved closer, looming behind her, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was as if the house itself had come alive, and something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I ran back home, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even stop to look behind me. I couldn't. The feeling of being hunted was too strong. The next day I saw her again, this time standing in the middle of the street, just staring at me. But now her face was completely blank, no emotion, no recognition. It was as if she was empty, hollow. And behind her, standing in the shadow of her house, I saw it again. That thing, the figure with the glowing eyes. I ran inside and locked the door, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. For hours, I sat in the living room waiting for something to happen. And then around midnight, I heard the knocking again. It was louder this time, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it. I had to see what it was. I opened the door slowly, heart hammering in my chest. And there she was. But this time, she wasn't just standing there. Her body was twisted, her face contorted in a grotesque grin, and her eyes, those terrible hollow eyes, were fixed on me. Her mouth opened, and she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers. It was deep and guttural, like something old and angry had taken over her. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice like a rasping wind. "She's already inside." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Vanished into the night, leaving me standing in the doorway, unable to move. I don't know how much time passed before I finally shut the door. I don't know what happened after that. All I know is that from that moment on, things changed. I moved out a week later, unable to shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me from the shadows. I don't know if my neighbor was ever the same. I never saw her again after that night. But every so often I find myself waking up in the middle of the night, staring out the window into the darkness, waiting for the flickering lights to start again. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear her voice, whispering that it's not over yet.
Next story.
I had always thought I knew what kind of person I was. I'd lived in the same town my entire life, never straying far from what I knew. I had my friends, my job at the local diner, and the kind of routine that makes you feel safe. I didn't believe in the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night, all nonsense. I laughed at horror movies and scoffed at the ghost stories the older folks in the diner would whisper over coffee. But that was before I moved into the old house at the end of Maple Street. The house wasn't much to look at. It was one of those century-old buildings with wooden floors, drafty windows, and a creaky front porch that looked like it had been neglected for decades. But it was affordable, and I had always dreamed of having a place of my own. The landlord was a quiet man named Mr. Calloway, an older gentleman who lived a few blocks away and didn't ask many questions. He was kind enough, though, and the rent was cheap, too good to pass up. When I moved in, everything seemed fine. The house was a bit run down, sure, but it had potential. The neighborhood was quiet, with only a handful of homes along the street. Most of the neighbors kept to themselves, and I liked that. It was peaceful. The first night, I had trouble falling asleep. The house groaned with the wind, the old pipes rattled, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. I told myself it was just the house settling, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I lay there in the dark, something caught my attention. It was a soft sound, almost like a whisper. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. There it was again, faint but clear. A voice, low and murmuring, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I shook it off, blaming the unfamiliar noises of the old building. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought. Or maybe I was just tired. So I turned over and tried to sleep. The next day, I went out to explore the neighborhood a little more. I passed by the neighbors' houses, but no one seemed to be around. I eventually made my way to the old church at the far end of the block, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Hatcher often sat on the steps, knitting or reading. I had seen her a few times before, but hadn't spoken to her yet. She looked up as I approached. Her face was lined with age, her gray hair tied up in a bun. She smiled faintly and waved me over. "New neighbor, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy but friendly. I saw the truck parked outside. "Hope you don't mind me saying so, but that house of yours has a bit of a reputation." I raised an eyebrow. "Reputation?" "Oh, yes," she said, nodding gravely. "The old house at the end of the street. It's been empty for years, but folks around here used to talk about it a lot. Some say it's haunted." I laughed nervously, brushing it off. "Haunted? I'm sure it's just an old house with a few squeaks and groans." Mrs. Hatcher looked at me with kind, tired eyes. "Maybe. But there's something different about it. Something people around here don't like to talk about." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I smiled politely and quickly excused myself. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but wonder if Mrs. Hatcher had been trying to warn me. I had lived in plenty of old homes before. There was always talk of strange noises or weird happenings. It didn't mean anything. That night, though, I started to feel like maybe there was more to her words than I'd given credit. The whispers came again. They were soft but insistent, as if someone was standing just outside my door, waiting to speak. My heart began to race, and I forced myself to get up and check the hallway. But as soon as I opened the door, the house was silent. I stood there in the dark for a few moments, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just the wind, the house settling, anything but what I feared. But when I stepped back into my room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor near the foot of my bed, there was a dark stain. It looked like ink or mud, but it was too dark, too thick to be either. I knelt down to touch it, and when I did, my hand trembled. The stain was cold to the touch, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I immediately jumped up, my heart pounding. The room felt heavy, suffocating. I looked around, my eyes darting from corner to corner, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Mr. Calloway, but the call wouldn't go through. The next few nights were a blur. The whispers became louder, more distinct, until I could hear them clearly in my room. They were soft but unmistakable. A voice, deep and raspy, calling my name. Elizabeth. I'd never told anyone my full name. I only introduced myself as Liz, but somehow this voice knew me, knew who I was. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, from the lack of sleep. I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house to get to the bottom of this once and for all. I ventured into the basement, where I'd noticed something odd the first time I'd explored the house, a small, hidden door behind some old boxes. It wasn't marked or obvious, but it was there like it had been purposely concealed. My hand shook as I touched the cold metal handle. With a creak, it opened into a narrow stairwell leading further down. I descended into the darkness, my flashlight barely illuminating the steps ahead of me. At the bottom, I found an old wooden door, its edges worn and scratched. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. As I opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. Inside, the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, ancient even. At the far end of the room was an altar, a stone slab, and the unmistakable scent of decay. And that's when I saw it. On the altar, an old journal lay open, pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, hands trembling, and flipped through it. It was written in a strange, flowing script, but the last few pages were in English. It was a diary belonging to the original owner of the house, a man named Thomas Calloway, the great-grandfather of my landlord. The last entry read, "I have made the pact. She has promised me immortality in exchange for my soul. I will live forever in this house, but she will come for others. She will claim them one by one until there is nothing left. I should have never made the deal. I should have never let her in." The whispering grew louder, now surrounding me until it became deafening. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift, taking form. I ran back up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the top, the door slammed shut behind me. The whispers stopped. The house was silent again, but I could still feel it, a presence lingering just beyond my sight. I don't know how much time passed, but when I turned around, Mr. Calloway was standing in the doorway. You shouldn't have come down here, Elizabeth," he said, his voice eerily calm. I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry. "You've seen too much," he continued, "and now she's coming for you too." Before I could respond, the air grew heavy, suffocating, and the whispers began again, louder this time, more insistent. I knew then that I would never leave this house. Not alive anyway, and I wasn't the first.
Next story.
It started a few weeks ago, and I've been trying to convince myself that it's nothing. But I know the truth now. There's something wrong with my neighbor, and I don't know how much longer I can take it. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily. I've lived in the same neighborhood for years, and nothing strange ever happened until they moved in. The house next door had been empty for a while. We all just assumed it was because it was a fixer-upper, but then one day, a new couple moved in. They didn't seem all that out of place at first. The woman, Lily, was in her late 20s with dark hair and bright eyes. She had a warm smile and would wave every time she saw me in the yard. Her husband, Matt, seemed quieter, more reserved. He was tall, lanky, always wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I didn't think anything of it, but things began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away. I guess it was the little things, the oddities that didn't seem like much when you noticed them individually, but became more unsettling as time went on. The first sign came when I saw Lily outside one evening, staring at my house. It was around sunset, and I was sitting on my porch, just enjoying the last bit of daylight. Lily was standing at the edge of her driveway, facing my house, not moving. At first, I thought she was just taking in the view, but as I kept watching, I realized she hadn't blinked once. Her eyes were fixed on my front door, unblinking, unrelenting. I felt uneasy. It wasn't like her. She was usually so friendly. I waved, trying to break the tension, but she didn't respond. I decided not to make too much of it, assuming she was just lost in thought or something. But when she came over the next day to return a borrowed cup, I couldn't ignore the change in her demeanor. She came inside and we chatted for a while. She kept her distance and her eyes seemed distracted. She wouldn't make eye contact for more than a few seconds. She asked how I'd been, but her voice was a little too high-pitched, like she was forcing it. I didn't think much of it, assuming maybe she was just having an off day. I even tried to joke with her to break the tension. But as I was talking, I noticed something strange. Matt, her husband, was standing at their window, watching us. He hadn't moved for the entire time I was with her. When I pointed it out, she didn't seem to care. She simply said, "Matt likes to keep an eye on things." I laughed nervously, but the whole situation felt wrong. I quickly finished my coffee and made an excuse to leave. I thought I was just overthinking things. After all, people had their quirks, right? But it got worse the next night. I had just gotten in from work and was about to settle down for dinner when I noticed something strange outside. There was Matt standing at the edge of his driveway, staring at my house. It was almost dark, and he didn't seem to notice the cold. He was just standing there, motionless. At first, I figured maybe he was waiting for Lily or something. But then I saw her, too. She was standing by the window in their living room, her face pressed against the glass, staring at me. I don't know what made me do it, but I walked outside. I don't know why, but something told me I needed to get their attention to make sure they weren't doing something strange. "Hey, Matt," I called, trying to break the silence. He didn't react. I raised my voice, calling his name again, but he still didn't move. Lily inside didn't seem to notice either. It was as though they were both completely unaware of my presence. Finally, I turned to head back inside, flat, confused, and a little disturbed. But then, just before I closed my door, I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, a voice, faint and distant. "Don't trust them." I whipped around, but there was no one there. The street was silent. I checked the windows, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. The next few days were a blur. The couple across the street became more and more distant. I barely saw them around. And when I did, Lily always seemed to be in a daze, like she wasn't quite aware of what was going on around her. But Matt, he was always watching. From the windows, from the street, from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was everywhere, his eyes always on me, always lurking. Then, a week ago, something happened that I'll never forget. It was late, around 2 in the morning, and I woke up to the sound of something scratching at my window. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch or a stray animal, but the sound was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate. And then I heard the faint whisper, the same voice from before. "Don't trust them." I felt my heart racing as I sat up in bed, staring at the window. The scratching stopped, but I still couldn't move. My whole body was frozen with fear. And then, as if on cue, I saw Matt standing outside. He was so close to the window that I could almost make out his features. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, were wide open. He was staring directly at me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could hit the dial button, he slowly backed away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know what to do. I felt completely powerless. The next morning, I went over to their house, trying to gather the courage to confront them, to ask what the hell was going on. When Lily opened the door, she didn't seem surprised to see me, but something was different. Her eyes were glassy, and she barely seemed to register I was standing there. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice vacant. I tried to ask her about Matt, about what was happening, but she just blinked, her face blank, and then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Matt's gone. He's not here anymore." I froze. What did she mean? I looked around the house. It felt empty, like something was missing. And then it hit me. The absence of Matt. The lingering feeling of his presence was gone. I could still feel his eyes on me, but I knew he wasn't there. He was gone. Before I could ask anything else, Lily turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open behind her. I stepped inside, my mind racing with questions, but when I looked around, everything was wrong. The house was darker than it should have been, and the air felt heavy. As I walked deeper into the living room, I noticed a picture frame on the table. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and looked at the photo. It was a picture of Lily and Matt, but something was wrong. They both looked different, like older, worn versions of themselves. And behind them, standing in the shadows, was the figure of a man, his face obscured. But I knew immediately who it was. It was me. And then I heard it again, that whisper, "Don't trust them." I dropped the photo and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I don't know what happened to them or why their house feels like it's haunted by something I can't explain. But I'm done trying to figure it out. I'm leaving this town. But I know one thing for sure. I will never forget the eyes that watched me from across the street. The eyes that never blinked. The eyes of someone who wasn't quite human. And I will never, ever trust them.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories, those late night tales my grandmother used to tell about haunted houses and restless spirits, but they never felt real. That is, until I moved into the house on Birchwood Avenue. It wasn't a big house. In fact, it was quite small, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Just the kind of place I'd always dreamed of. Charming, affordable, a little worn, but full of potential. When I first saw the house, something about it felt off, but I ignored the uneasy feeling. The realtor was enthusiastic, pointing out the fireplace, the hardwood floors, and the large windows that let in an abundance of light. The neighbors, she said, were friendly and would be a great addition to my new life. The first few days were perfect. I unpacked, arranged the furniture, and settled into my new routine. But then, on the fifth night, something happened. It was around 11:30 p.m. I had just finished a late dinner when I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the front door. My heart skipped. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the peephole and saw nothing, just the empty porch. I stood there, confused, but then the knocking started again. This time, louder, more urgent. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, half expecting a delivery or a neighbor dropping by to introduce themselves. But when I opened the door, there was no one there. I looked around, down the street, but the only thing I saw was the old oak tree at the end of the block. There was no sign of movement, nothing. I closed the door, chalking it up to nerves, but then the knocking started again, this time from the back door. I froze, my blood running cold. Who could be at the back door? I made my way through the kitchen, every step feeling heavier, every shadow more sinister than the last. As I reached the back door, I saw a faint silhouette through the frosted glass. Someone was standing there, just out of sight. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with possibilities. I took a deep breath and opened the door slowly. There was no one there, just the empty yard. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, and told myself it was just my imagination. The house was old, maybe the wood settled or the wind played tricks. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house kept me awake, wondering if something was just waiting for me to drift off. The next day, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Harlow. She was an older woman, probably in her late 70s, with thick glasses and a nervous smile. I had noticed her watching me as I unpacked the previous day, and today she was standing on her porch, waving at me. I went over to introduce myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear," she said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Harlow. I live next door. I see you've gotten settled in." "Thank you," I replied, smiling back, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at me a little too intently. "It's a nice area." Mrs. Harlow's smile faded slightly, and she glanced around before leaning in closer. "You're in the old Whitmore house, aren't you?" I nodded. "Yeah, I am. It's a little run down, but it has charm." She lowered her voice, her eyes darting nervously. "Be careful in that house, dear. They say it's cursed. Strange things happen there. I'm sure you've heard the stories." "Cursed?" I laughed, though it sounded hollow. "I don't believe in curses. Just an old house with some history, I guess." She sighed, shaking her head. "You'll see. Everyone who lives there eventually leaves, but not always on their own terms." I chuckled nervously, but a part of me couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. I tried to dismiss her warning, but that night, as the clock struck midnight, the knocking came again. Soft, faint, almost like a whisper against the wood. I froze, my mind racing. It was happening again. This time, I didn't go to the door. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the living room, my eyes fixed on the hallway that led to the front door. My heart hammered in my chest as the knocking continued, but there was something different about it now. It was rhythmic, like a pattern, like it was trying to communicate. I finally mustered the courage to check the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. Not a soul in sight. But as I stepped out onto the porch, a cold gust of wind blew through me, sending a chill down my spine. It felt like something was standing just out of reach, waiting for me to step closer. I ran back inside and locked the door again, but the knocking didn't stop. It only grew louder, more persistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I called Mrs. Harlow, desperate for some explanation, even though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. When she answered, her voice was tight, as if she had been expecting my call. "You heard it, didn't you?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "The knocking. What is it? What's happening?" "It's the Whitmore curse." she whispered, her voice barely audible. Every night, the spirit of Eliza Whitmore knocks at the door. She's trapped in that house, trapped by something dark. She's calling for help, but no one answers. It's been happening for years. No one who stays in that house ever lasts. You must leave, dear. It's your only chance. Her words sent a cold shiver through my entire body. Who is she? Eliza Whitmore was the last owner of that house. She was a kind woman, but she was involved in something she shouldn't have. She made a deal, a pact with something dark, something ancient, and now she can't rest. But why is she knocking at my door? I asked, my voice trembling. Because she wants to be freed. She's trying to warn you. She's trying to reach you, Mrs. Harlow said, her voice barely above a whisper. But you have to be careful. The thing that's holding her there, it will come for you if you don't leave. I hung up the phone, my thoughts spinning. The house, the knocking, Mrs. Harlow's warnings, it all felt like too much. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there and never look back. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was something holding me there, something I couldn't explain. That night, the knocking came again, and this time I couldn't ignore it. I opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I looked outside, there was no one there. Instead, there was only darkness. And then I saw her, Eliza Whitmore. She stood in the shadows, her pale face illuminated by the dim porch light. Her eyes were wide, hollow, filled with terror. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was trying to speak, trying to warn me. But before I could step closer, the shadows around her twisted, and something dark and monstrous reached out from the depths of the night. It was then that I understood. Leaving wasn't an option. Whatever Eliza had done, whatever deal she had made, had brought something far worse into this world. Something that wouldn't let me leave. The knocking wasn't a plea for help. It was a warning. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And now it wanted me to.
Next story.
It was one of those hot, sticky summer days when the air hangs heavy and you can't escape the oppressive heat. I just moved into a new house with my boyfriend, Ben. It was an old colonial-style home, charming, if not a little worn down. But the price was right, and we were eager to start a new chapter of our lives. The neighborhood was quiet, full of aging houses with neatly manicured lawns and quiet streets. There was one house that always caught my attention, the one across the street. It was a large, crumbling structure, completely abandoned. The lawn was overgrown, the windows boarded up, and the shutters hung loosely on their hinges. It had an eerie vibe to it, but I didn't think much of it. Ben and I were busy fixing up our own place, and we didn't have time to worry about an old rundown house. A few days after we moved in, I saw her for the first time. I was sitting on the porch sipping my morning coffee when I noticed a woman standing at the front gate of the abandoned house. She was tall, pale, with long, dark hair that hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. She stared at the house, unmoving, as if waiting for something, or someone. I was about to call out to her, thinking she might be lost or confused, but she turned sharply and walked toward the house, disappearing behind the overgrown hedges. I didn't think too much of it. Maybe she was a neighbor from a few streets over, or someone just passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later that evening, Ben and I were watching TV when I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside our window. I glanced toward the window, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I got up to check, but when I pulled the curtain back, there was no one there. I chalked it up to the wind or a passing car, though I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching us. The house across the street was completely dark, the windows empty. That night, after Ben had fallen asleep, I lay awake, unable to shake the feeling of unease. I could hear creaking sounds coming from the walls, almost like footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. My heart raced, and I held my breath, listening intently. Then, there it was, a soft, eerie whisper, so faint I almost couldn't make it out. It was a woman's voice. "Let me in." I froze, my skin prickling with cold. The voice seemed to come from the hallway, right outside our bedroom door. I strained my ears, hoping it was just my imagination, but I heard it again. "Let me in." I scrambled out of bed, my heart thumping in my chest. I opened the bedroom door slowly, my hand shaking as I reached for the light switch. But when I flicked it on, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stood there, trembling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But as I glanced over to the staircase that led up to the attic, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The attic door was slightly ajar. I was certain it had been shut earlier when I checked. My mind raced. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every creak and whisper made my skin crawl. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, listening for the voice that had haunted me. I tried to tell myself that it was just nerves, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I tried to talk to Ben about it, but he was skeptical. He said I was probably just tired from the move, that stress was getting to me. So I decided to let it go, at least for the time being. But that afternoon, I saw her again, the woman from the abandoned house. This time, she was standing at the edge of our driveway, just staring at me. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and unsettling, and her gaze never wavered. She stood completely still, as if waiting for me to make the first move. I was paralyzed. I couldn't take my eyes off her, and she didn't move an inch. I felt the air around me grow colder, and I shivered involuntarily. Something was wrong with her. I had the overwhelming urge to run, to get away from her, but I couldn't. She was like a magnet, pulling me in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she took a step toward me. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away. But before I could turn and retreat inside, she spoke in a low, rasping voice. "You shouldn't have moved here." Her words were cold, chilling, and they seemed to echo in my mind long after she had disappeared. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know what to do. Who was she? And why was she watching us? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that house and with her. I didn't want to tell Ben. He'd only brush it off as my overactive imagination again. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen and what I had heard. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds from the walls had returned, louder than before. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was walking around upstairs. I grabbed my phone and called Ben, but it went straight to voicemail. I was completely alone. Suddenly, the door to the attic creaked open. I stood frozen, unable to move. There was no way anyone was up there. The attic was locked. I had checked. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the stairs. I had to do something. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I knew it was ridiculous, but I had to protect myself. I walked slowly toward the attic door, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated, but then I pushed the door open. It was pitch dark inside, the air thick with dust and mildew. I took a step forward, but then I heard it. The softest whisper, barely audible. "Get out!" I turned to flee, but as I did, I saw her standing in the doorway. The woman. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, her mouth twisted into an unnatural smile. "You should have stayed away." Before I could react, she lunged at me, and I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. My heart was racing as I scrambled to get away. I could hear her footsteps closing in on me, growing louder and more frantic. In a panic, I ran to the front door, throwing it open and bolted outside into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house, breathless and terrified. The neighbor, an older man named Mr. Jenkins, opened the door, his eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with alarm. I don't know. There's something wrong with the house," I gasped. "The woman, she won't leave me alone." Mr. Jenkins' expression changed from concern to something more serious. "You saw her?" he whispered. "You saw the woman from the old house?" I nodded, trembling. He let out a deep sigh. I knew this day would come. It turns out the woman I had seen was no stranger. She was the last owner of the abandoned house across the street, a woman named Evelyn, who had mysteriously disappeared over 20 years ago. There were rumors that she had been involved in something dark, something that left her soul tethered to the house. As for me, well, I never went back. That night, Ben and I left the house, and we never returned. But the thing about places like that is they don't let go easily. Sometimes when the night is still and the air is thick, I swear I can hear her voice whispering, "Let me in."
Next story.
I had always loved the quiet, small-town life. Growing up in a bustling city had its perks, but when I moved to the countryside for a fresh start, everything changed. The air was cleaner, the pace was slower, and people seemed genuinely friendly. I found a charming little house on the outskirts of town, a cozy two-story place with a faded white picket fence surrounded by tall trees. It was just what I needed, peaceful with just enough space for me to unwind. At first, everything felt perfect. I spent my weekends exploring the woods behind the house, getting to know the local market, and, chatting with the neighbors who always greeted me with warm smiles. Everyone was welcoming, but there was one neighbor who stood out, a woman named Linda. She lived in a house down the road, just a few minutes' walk from mine. She was middle-aged, a little eccentric, with graying hair that was always pulled into a messy bun, and an air of mystery about her that intrigued me. One evening, as I was sitting on my porch enjoying a cup of tea, Linda walked by with her dog. She smiled and waved, and I waved back, though there was something different in her expression that night, something almost distant. "Evening, Emma," she called out, her voice unusually soft. "You doing well?" I nodded. "Yeah, everything's great. Just settling in." Linda's smile faded slightly, and she stopped in front of my gate. "Good. I hope it stays that way for you." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Linda hesitated, then seemed to catch herself. "Oh, nothing. Just be careful, okay? The house you're in, it's been vacant for a reason." Before I could respond, she turned and continued down the road, her dog tugging at its leash. I watched her disappear into the fading light, a chill creeping up my spine. What did she mean by that? I had never heard any rumors about the house, and everything had seemed perfectly fine so far. The next few days were normal. I spent my time getting the house in order and trying to meet more of the neighbors. But that night, as I lay in bed, something felt off. The house, which had always felt cozy and welcoming, now seemed different. It felt heavier, as though something was pressing in from all sides. I tried to shake the feeling, but I couldn't. The quiet of the night was interrupted by a sound. It was faint at first, almost like a rustling. I sat up, straining to hear, but the noise stopped. I brushed it off as the wind or the house settling, but then the sound came again, a scraping like something being dragged across the floor. I got up and checked the hallway, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing, just the usual shadows cast by the moonlight filtering through the windows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, Linda came by again, but this time she wasn't walking her dog. She was standing at the end of my driveway, just watching. When she saw me step out onto the porch, she gave me a tight-lipped smile. "I thought I should let you know something," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "The house you're living in, it wasn't always just a house, it's something more." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Linda's gaze shifted nervously toward the trees. "There's something in that house, something that's been there for generations. It feeds on the living, on their fear, and it doesn't like strangers." I laughed, unsure of how to respond. "Are you telling me the house is haunted?" Linda's expression darkened. "No, it's not ghosts you should be worried about. It's the thing that comes with the house. You won't see it, but it sees you, and it knows when you're alone." I thought she was just trying to scare me, but something about her tone made me pause. "What happens if it notices you?" Linda swallowed hard. "It takes what it wants, and once it's done with you, you'll never leave. No one ever has. I'm sorry. I tried to warn you." I opened my mouth to ask her what she meant, but before I could speak, she turned and walked briskly back toward her house, leaving me standing there, staring after her. That night, the noises came again. This time, they were louder, more persistent. The scraping, like something dragging along the floor, grew to a constant rhythmic sound. It was coming from upstairs. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the stillness. When I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. Dead silence. I was sweating now, my pulse pounding in my ears. I slowly crept down the hallway toward the door of the guest bedroom. That was where the noise had been coming from. I pushed the door open. Nothing. Just an empty room, bathed in moonlight, but the feeling, the heavy, oppressive feeling, was still there, as if something was waiting, watching. The door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. The room was still, except for the sound of my breathing and the eerie weight in the air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow. It moved across the far wall, but when I turned to look, it was gone. I froze. The air was thick with something ancient, something malevolent. And that was when I realized what Linda meant. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by something else, a presence that thrived on the living, on their fear. And it wasn't done with me yet. I ran downstairs, my mind racing. I needed to leave. I had to get out. But as I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, but it was stuck, as if someone was holding it shut from the other side. I turned, my body shaking, and that's when I saw it. In the doorway to the kitchen, standing just beyond the threshold of the room, was a figure. Tall, thin, and shadowed, its features obscured by darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The thing raised a hand, long, bony fingers stretching toward me. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath. And then, with a sudden, gut-wrenching jolt, the door flew open. I ran out into the night, not looking back, not daring to. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted down the road toward Linda's house, but I didn't stop until I reached her porch. I pounded on the door, heart in my throat. When Linda opened it, she looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. "You were warned," she said softly. "You shouldn't have stayed." I didn't speak. I couldn't. I could still feel its presence behind me, waiting, lurking in the dark. Linda nodded, as if she knew what I was thinking. It never lets go. And as I turned to face the house one last time, I saw the figure standing in the window, its eyes gleaming in the dark. And I knew, deep down, that it would never let me go.
Next story.
The first time I saw the old man, I thought nothing of it. It was a Tuesday, and I was out for my usual morning jog, the sun barely rising over the horizon. The streets were quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the pavement. As I rounded the corner near the park, I saw him sitting on a bench by the swings, his back hunched and his face hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He was a strange sight, a figure from another time, his clothes old-fashioned and worn. But he didn't look like a threat, just an old man passing the time. I nodded politely as I jogged past, and he did the same, barely lifting his head. I didn't think much of it, continuing on my way. But as I jogged around the loop and came back past the park, I noticed something odd. He was still there, sitting on the bench, perfectly still, staring ahead. It was as if no time had passed at all. I tried to brush it off. It was just a coincidence, right? But then the next day I saw him again. And the day after that, and every day after, without fail, he was there, sitting in the same spot at the same time without moving an inch. It didn't take long for my curiosity to get the better of me. One morning, I stopped my jog in front of the bench and took a deep breath before sitting down beside him. I hadn't meant to disturb him, but I couldn't ignore the strange urge to speak with him. "Good morning," I said hesitantly. The old man didn't respond at first, but then slowly he turned his head toward me. His eyes were dark and distant, like they had seen too much. His gaze was unsettling, as though he could see right through me. "Good morning, young one," he said in a voice that was rough but gentle, like an old record player, cracked and worn. "You're the one who's been running by, aren't you?" I nodded. "Yes, I run here every day. I've noticed you sitting here a lot." The old man chuckled softly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I've been sitting here for a long time, child. A very long time." I didn't know how to respond. His words were cryptic, and I couldn't quite grasp what he meant. The moment stretched awkwardly, and I was about to get up and continue my jog when he spoke again. "You should be careful, you know. Not everyone who comes here comes with good intentions." I frowned, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if sharing some kind of secret. "This park, this place, it's not as innocent as it seems. There are things here, things that follow people who stay too long, things that don't belong." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure if he was just an old man with a strange sense of humor or if there was something more to his words, but something in the way he said it made me uneasy. I stood up, brushing the discomfort aside, but as I did, I noticed something strange. His hands. They were thin and gnarled, the fingers almost skeletal, like they had aged far beyond the rest of him. I forced a smile. "Thanks for the warning. I'll keep that in mind." The old man didn't say anything else, just sat there, watching me as I jogged away. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I'd always loved the park, loved the sense of peace it gave me, but now, after hearing those words, it felt different, darker somehow. The next morning, I ran my usual route, but as I approached the park, a strange sensation washed over me. The air felt heavier, colder, and the once familiar path seemed foreign. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just in my head, but as I got closer to the swings, I saw him again. The old man. He was still sitting there, just like before, but this time something was different. He wasn't looking straight ahead. His head was tilted to the side, his eyes narrowed as if he was watching something, or someone, just out of my line of sight. My heart began to race. I didn't want to stop, but the overwhelming urge to approach him tugged at me. I slowed down, my breath quickening, and as I reached the bench, I called out to him. "Hey, are you okay?" He didn't move, not even a twitch. But then a voice came from behind me. Soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Don't trust him." I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone. I glanced back at the old man. His eyes were now locked onto mine, his gaze even more intense than before. And then he whispered something that made my stomach drop. Too late. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran. My legs burned, my heart pounded, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That evening, I went home and tried to forget about the strange encounter, but it was impossible. I kept thinking about the old man's words and the eerie feeling that lingered in the pit of my stomach. I tried to tell Ben, but he just laughed it off, saying I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But the next day, something happened that I couldn't explain. I went for my morning jog like I always did, but when I reached the park, I froze. The bench where the old man always sat was empty. There was no sign of him anywhere. It was strange because he'd never missed a day. But it wasn't just his absence that made me uneasy. It was the feeling of something lurking in the shadows. I could feel it, even though I couldn't see anything. I turned around to leave, but just as I was about to exit the park, I heard the familiar voice, low and unsettling. "You shouldn't have run." I spun around, my heart in my throat, and there, standing at the edge of the swings, was the old man. But this time he wasn't sitting on the bench. He was standing, his back hunched, his hands reaching out toward me. "Stay," he rasped, his voice deepening. "It's too late to leave now." I took a step back, but something was pulling me toward him, a force I couldn't explain. My feet felt heavy, as if the earth beneath me was pulling me down. The park had gone quiet, too quiet. The usual birds were silent, the wind still. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a shadow, moving quickly across the ground, stretching long and dark in the early morning light. It was coming straight for me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, my legs moving faster than I ever thought possible, but no matter how fast I went, the shadow followed, growing closer until I could feel it, cold and heavy, like death itself, right behind me. I never went back to that park. I couldn't, and I never saw the old man again. But sometimes, when I'm out for a run in a new place, I can feel it, that dark presence lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. And every now and then, if I'm alone, I hear that same voice whispering from somewhere just beyond my reach. Too late.
Next story.
I've been living in this house for about 3 years now. It's a small 2-story place on the outskirts of a quiet suburban neighborhood. At first glance, it seems normal enough. Neighbors wave when you pass, the kids play in their front yards, and the occasional barbecue fills the air with the smell of charred burgers. But that first night, the night I moved in, everything changed. It was late when the moving truck pulled away, leaving me alone with nothing but boxes and the unsettling silence of a new home. The house had been empty for months before I came, and I was looking forward to the peace and quiet, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of the city. But as I carried the last box inside, I noticed something strange. The house across the street, number 11, had its porch light on. I couldn't help but stare at it, the harsh glow casting long shadows on the sidewalk. It was the only light on in the entire street. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the window, staring right at me. A woman, pale and thin, her features obscured by the darkness, but her eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They seemed to pierce right through me, locking onto mine. I froze, unable to look away, and for a moment I thought she was going to move closer, but she didn't. She just stood there, watching. I blinked, and when I looked back, she was gone. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the exhaustion from the move making me see things. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first real sign came a week later. I was sitting in my living room when I heard a loud knock at the door. I got up, opening it to find no one there. Just as I was about to close it, I noticed something strange on the porch. A small envelope, old and worn, with my name scribbled on it in what looked like shaky handwriting. I opened it carefully, half expecting a joke or some kind of prank from the neighborhood kids, but instead, the letter was empty. Nothing but a single sentence written on the inside. I see you. I don't know why, but that simple sentence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but there was nothing, just the usual quiet. I shoved the letter in my pocket and went inside, locking the door behind me. The next night, the knocking started again, only this time it was louder, more persistent. I waited, unsure whether to open the door or ignore it, but curiosity got the best of me. When I opened it, there was no one there again. But this time, there was something on the doorstep. A doll. It wasn't a normal doll. It looked old, like something you'd find at a yard sale or an antique store. Its clothes were ragged, its porcelain face cracked in places. But what stood out the most were the eyes. They were wide open, staring directly at me. I picked it up cautiously, my skin crawling as I did. There was no note this time, just the doll. I brought it inside, setting it on the mantel above the fireplace as a kind of twisted curiosity. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of the doll's eyes on me, watching me from across the room. Over the next few days, things escalated. The knocking never stopped. Sometimes it would be faint, barely audible, and other times it would shake the door with force. Each time I'd open it, and there would be nothing. But the doll, it started to change. Its position would shift. I'd find it in a different spot every morning, on the chair, on the table, once even in my bed, its cold porcelain fingers brushing against my sheets. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was getting paranoid from lack of sleep. But then one night I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't knocking this time. It was scratching, like fingernails on wood. I grabbed a flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, and cautiously walked to the door. The scratching stopped as soon as I reached the threshold, and I stood there, frozen. The door was ajar. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure of it. I pushed it open, and the house was eerily quiet. But then I heard it. The faintest sound, like whispering, coming from the direction of the window across the room. My heart raced as I crept toward it, flashlight in hand. When I shone the light in the corner, I froze. There, in the corner of the room, was the woman from across the street. She was standing in the same place she had been when I first saw her, her face pale and hollow, her black hair hanging limp over her face. She was whispering, her lips barely moving. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them in my chest, vibrating through the air like some kind of terrible energy. And then she turned to face me. Her eyes were empty now, just dark holes that seemed to pull me in, dragging me closer. I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hands. But before I could run, she raised her arm, pointing at me. And the whispering grew louder. "Leave before it's too late." I ran. I didn't care what was happening. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, not even stopping to lock it behind me. I sprinted across the street to number 11, knocking furiously on the door. An old man answered, his face wrinkled and tired, his eyes squinting in the dim light. "Can I help you?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, breathless, staring at him. And then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Behind him, in the hallway, was a familiar figure. The woman from the window. She was standing in the hallway now, her eyes locked onto mine, and as I looked back at the man, I realized with horror, he couldn't see her. She wasn't just a neighbor. She wasn't just a woman who lived across the street. She was something else. Before I could speak, the man smiled grimly, his voice low and heavy. "She's been waiting for you, you know. She's been waiting for a long time." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned and ran, back across the street to my house, the sound of the woman's whispering following me the entire way. The next day, the doll was gone. I've never seen the woman again, but the knocking continues. Every night without fail. Sometimes when I open the door, there's nothing there. Other times, there's a note, just a single sentence, written in shaky handwriting. You can't escape. I've thought about moving, but I know it wouldn't help. No matter where I go, I'll always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment when I hear the knock again. When I open the door, and it's her standing there, watching me. And I know I'll never be able to outrun it.
Next story.
It was late one evening when I first saw the lights. I was on my way home after a long shift at the restaurant, my car winding through the dark, lonely roads of the countryside. The air was thick with fog, and the headlights barely cut through it, casting a ghostly glow on the winding path ahead. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge when driving through this stretch of road, but tonight, something felt different. I had lived in this small town my entire life, so I knew the roads like the back of my hand. There was only one stretch that always made me feel uneasy, a sharp turn around an old abandoned house. People around here had their stories about the place, about strange happenings and mysterious disappearances, but it always seemed like nothing more than old, tired gossip to me. But tonight, as I neared the bend, I saw the lights. They flickered in the distance, faint and soft, like the glow of a candle. I stopped my car, squinting into the fog. It couldn't have been headlights from another vehicle. There were no cars in sight. I told myself it was probably just the reflection of something in the fog, but as I drove closer, the lights grew brighter, clearer. They were coming from the house, the old house. I had heard the rumors about the place, of course. People said that a family had lived there years ago before they all mysteriously vanished. There were tales of strange sounds and unexplained lights coming from the house, but no one had lived there in decades. It was abandoned, rotting under years of neglect. No one ever dared go near it, not even kids looking for a dare. But now, there they were, those faint lights, illuminating the upstairs windows, casting shadows that seemed to shift in the fog. I had to know what was going on. It wasn't like me to give in to curiosity, but something about it tugged at me. Maybe I'd finally get to the bottom of the mystery that had haunted this town for so long. I parked my car at the edge of the road and got out. The fog clung to my clothes like damp sheets, but I hardly noticed. My heart pounded as I made my way to the house. The lights flickered again, growing brighter, but they didn't seem to move. They remained fixed, as if calling me. I stood at the front door for a moment, hesitant, but the desire to see inside overpowered my fear. I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, and as I stepped inside, I could hear the sound of something faintly creaking upstairs, like a slow, methodical pace. The stairs loomed before me. I took a deep breath, my heart racing, and began to climb. The boards groaned under my weight, and I wondered for a brief second whether I should turn back. But the lights continued to beckon me. When I reached the top, the lights seemed to be coming from a room at the end of the hallway. I could see the soft flicker beneath the door, the shadows dancing across the floor. I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was strangely pristine, as if time had forgotten it. The walls were adorned with old, faded wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in dust, but it looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. And then in the center of the room was a small table, lit by several candles, real candles. The flames flickered but didn't seem to move in the way a candle flame should. They were unnaturally still, as if frozen in time. And there, sitting at the table, was an old woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and hollow, like something from a nightmare. She didn't seem to notice me at first, her hands trembling slightly as she moved something on the table, something I couldn't quite make out. "Who are you?" I whispered, stepping closer. The woman's head snapped up, and for a moment she simply stared at me. Her eyes seemed to pierce through me, as if she could see into my very soul. Then, her lips curled into a smile that was both welcoming and unsettling. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice low and raspy, like a wind through dry leaves. "You've finally come to see." "See what?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "The truth," she replied, her voice echoing in the empty room. "The truth of what happened here." I didn't know what she was talking about, but I couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about her presence, something that made me unable to move, like I was stuck in place. She reached into the table, her hands trembling as she pulled out something small, something wrapped in cloth. She handed it to me, her fingers cold against my skin. I unwrapped it slowly, and my stomach churned as I saw what it was: a locket. The metal was tarnished with age, the clasp broken, but inside there was a photograph, a black and white photo of a family: man, woman, and two children, their faces smiling in a way that felt too perfect, too serene. I could barely breathe as I stared at the image. The faces, so familiar yet so distant. The woman in the photo was smiling just like the woman in front of me. "Do you recognize them?" the woman asked, her voice growing distant as if she were somewhere else entirely. I nodded, though I didn't know how or why. The family in the photo, why did they seem so familiar? And then the truth hit me like a hammer to the chest. They were my family, I whispered, my heart racing. I I remember. The woman nodded, a sad smile on her face. "It was you, wasn't it? The one who left, the one who didn't come back." I didn't understand what she meant. "No, that's not possible. I wasn't even born yet." The woman's eyes filled with sorrow. "It doesn't matter. You left them, and they've been waiting ever since. They never left this house, and neither did I." Suddenly, the room grew colder, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching and warping. The candles flickered violently, casting a twisted light over the old woman's face. Her smile turned sinister, her eyes wide with an unnatural hunger. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "Now you'll stay here with us. Forever." The ground beneath me seemed to shift. I turned to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself was pulling me in, holding me in place, keeping me from escaping. I looked at the locket again, and the photo had changed. The family was still smiling, but now their eyes were hollow, their smiles twisted into something far darker. The last thing I remember was hearing their voices, whispering, calling my name, inviting me to join them in the darkness.